Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Science and Technology Q&A for kids and others. So we seem to have, as so often, a bunch of saved up questions here, but I'm happy to try and address anything about science, technology, etc. All right, we have a question here from Smart. Do you think it's possible to time travel for real? You know, time travel is one of these things that people kind of talk about. I don't know when the first time when people really started talking about time travel was. I kind of think the H.G. Wells time travel time machine book from like the very late 1800s might have been the first time. But this idea that just like we can travel around in space, so also we should be able to travel around in time is at some level a strange idea. It's a strange idea with respect to our usual experience of time, which is time, you know, you can choose where to go in space. You can go somewhere, you can go back from where you went, you can move around wherever you want in space. But in time, we seem to inexorably move through time, and there doesn't seem to be any way to go back. Now, you know, we want to travel to the future, we just sort of freeze ourselves. You know, every time you go to sleep, you're sort of traveling to the future in the sense that your thread of consciousness kind of wakes up the next day and you've traveled to the future, so to speak. But that's not usually what people mean by time travel. What people usually mean is we can move back to some time in some place in time and then choose to move forward in time, choose to move backward in time at our choice, so to speak. This idea doesn't really make a lot of sense. Mostly. Let's talk about what it would mean if you went back in time and then time moves forward from where you went back to. So you say, I'm going to change what I did X number of years ago, and then I'm going to sort of relive life going forwards. Well, what will have happened? Well, if you are in the same universe, so to speak, that you were in when you went, quotes, back in time, really what has to have happened is you have to have created this loop where you have kind of consistency between what happened back in time and forward in time. You create kind of, so in a sense, what all that time travel could achieve is having this consistency between what happened in the past and what happened in the future. And there are many ways that achieve that. There are many things that achieve that. For example, if you have a pendulum swinging back and forth, it's kind of achieving consistency with what happens with it in the future, what happens with the past. And that's in a sense the thing that when you start thinking about, you know, models of space-time, for example, that support, quotes, time travel, the official version of that in theory of gravity is what are called closed time-like curves, CTCs. And what a closed time-like curve is a place where there is sort of this connection between the past and the future, that kind of where you are. But what all that's really happening in the end is that you're creating a forced consistency between what happens in the past and what happens in the future. It's not that you in the future can think, oh, am I going to go back to the past today or not? There is a forced consistency of what happened in the past and what's going to happen in the future. Now, even this idea of the possibility of closed time-like curves is something that is a weird thing to show up in physics, although it's not that hard to understand what's going on. It's just this consistency between what happens in the past, what's going to happen in the future. But there are models of space-time where you get closed time-like curves that are the result of singularities in space-time and things like this. They're kind of pathologies in the usual theory of general relativity, the usual theory of gravity. They're pathologies that actually, it is usually believed, are kind of permanently hidden from us by event horizons and so on, by the fact that even if there is one of these things there that we can never kind of know about it from the outside. So, but in our current models of physics, the general idea of time travel makes absolutely no sense, because in our recent models of physics, the progress of time is the inexorable doing of computation. The universe is represented as some giant network of atoms of space or whatever, And as you progress in time, there's a computation that's going on where you're progressively rewriting that network of atoms of space. And it's not the case that you can just sort of say, well, I'm going to jump forwards in time. There's this irreducible computational process that represents the evolution, the progression in time. And again, if you were to have something like one of these closed time-like curves, all that does is to say this thing that happened in the past must be consistent with this thing that's happening in the future. You don't get to make sort of the arbitrary choice of now I'm going to choose to go back to the past and so on. So I think in the end, I think time travel is something that as such, it's just not a thing that makes any sense. Now, you can get kind of the equivalent of time travel in some ways. For example, what does it mean to travel to the future? In part, it's a one-way trip. You kind of are sort of shutting yourself down and only thinking about things again in the future. So your thread of time has this kind of jump to the future aspect to it, although you don't get to go back. In terms of the past, one of the things that I find interesting about sort of the development of technology and science and so on is the extent to which we can learn more and more about the past. One might have thought that, oh, well, whatever is, the only way we know about the past is from books people wrote about the past. But then there start to be all these kind of hints of the past, whether it's from the genomes of humans, where we can see from the way that genomes changed and so on, we can see some detail about how some family relation between humans in the distant past or some migration of humans. Or when we look at some archaeological site and we realize, oh, there's this, this plate that people ate food off, 6,000 years ago, and there's a little tiny molecular trace of the food they ate. And we can go and look at the DNA of the little, pieces of sheep meat or something that were on there and deduce things about the types of sheep that existed at that time. This ability to go in and sort of tease out things from history from these little molecular traces is something that's interesting. And I think there'll be more of that to come. But between DNA and these kind of trace amounts of different materials and so on, and exactly how was this sword used? Well, we can study the micro details of what happened to the sword to know this sword was used in 7 battles or something in this way and that way. I think one of the themes here is solid materials often have a trace of their history. In something like a gas, there is ultimately a trace of the history and all the details of how the molecules are moving around, but we are completely unable in the current state of technology to know that history. And I don't think that history will be easy to deduce for very far going back into the past, or probably at most kind of minutes, I would think. But when it comes to solids, the details of the arrangement of molecules or atoms on the surface of a solid or in the interior of a solid will give clues about what happened to that solid in the distant past. It's kind of the ultimate forensic science type of thing. You just look at you can imagine kind of unraveling every atom that you see in some surface, and you say, well, how many times were these keys pressed and in what order? Well, you start to look at every little atomic change that was made, every little piece of kind of grease from fingers and things like that went onto keys. And you'll be able to start deducing that if you look sufficiently carefully at a kind of molecular scale. I think it's kind of the type of thing which, as we get to start doing molecular scale computing better, it's a thing where I suspect there will be sort of a dramatic advance in the ability to kind of reconstruct the past from sort of details, molecular level details, particularly in solids, that were left over from the past. So we don't get to do sort of actual time travel, but for example, one of the things that's kind of the test case is, could we ever imagine finding something which told us what ancient Babylonian languages sounded like? And obviously we can get clues from how they were, the mistakes they made in stories where somebody thought they heard one word, but actually it was another word that was being said, puns that were made, things like that. That gives us some clues. But could there be something where there's a material object where somebody was talking to somebody else while they were making a piece of clay on a potter's wheel or something, and that the vibrations caused some change in the molecular structure of the clay as a result of what they were saying, and that's now burnt in, and 4,000 years later we can come and decode it. Maybe that type of thing will become possible. I think it's quite likely it will become possible, and we'll be able to do much more sort of detailed reconstruction of history than we have in the past. I mean, I think people are quite surprised, might have been quite surprised, that it's possible to know the kind of, we will know the genealogy of the 100 billion humans who've lived, probably pretty accurately. We know, we'll be able to gradually start filling in this network of sort of all of the 100 billion humans that have lived, and that will give us some, well, it will probably have interesting historical and other implications. But I don't think sort of time travel in the physical, get in a time machine and go and set the GPS or GTS or something to say go to this time. That's just not going to be possible. I think that's inconsistent with kind of, it's sort of philosophically inconsistent. It's not a physical impossibility. It's kind of a philosophical impossibility. Let's see, there's a question here from Asa. Has Darwinian evolution stopped in humans? And if so, are we descending to extinction because of dysgenics? Well, gosh, what is Darwinian evolution? It's basically the sort of the idea of natural selection is the fittest organisms will make more organisms, will have more children organisms. And so the total number of organisms that you'll get of that type will gradually increase. And if there's some trait, like if you've got a longer beak, you end up being able to catch more fish, and then you end up having more children, then that trait will gradually end up being dominant in the population. And sort of the basic idea is, because there is random mutation, and some birds will have longer beaks, some birds will have shorter beaks. The ones that are shorter beaks are kind of the losers, and they'll have less children. The ones that have longer beaks are the winners and will have more children, and so on. And that is, and that's kind of the thing that leads certain traits to become dominant. And progressively, maybe, first it's the longer beak, then it turns out it's better to have a great big tuft of feathers on your head or something. And so that will end up becoming a more significant trait, and so on. It's worth realizing that evolution can't do everything. Those random mutations can only make small changes. The big dramatic changes, they happen very gradually. And you can see that in the fossil record. Things gradually get longer, gradually get shorter. Sometimes it's like there's a period of local stability when there's a definite species that's formed, and it's like, this is good in the particular niche in the particular place in the world, and etc., with the other species that are around. This is a good scheme. We'll just stick this way for 10 million years or whatever it is. And then maybe something changes in the world, or something changes in the configuration of other species, or just there's a rare mutation that figures out some great thing that ends up being a better solution that leads the organism to have more children, and so on. So what's happened with humans? Well, it's a complicated story, because a lot of our technology and ways of life have separated the purely biological, what's fitter, what's not fitter, in terms of what would be kind of the raw biology. It's now sort of co-evolving with aspects of our technology and our societies and things like this. And if you have a place which says, if you have, for example, I don't know, a country which says, one child per family, clearly that's going to, that whatever traits existed in that population, there'll be fewer of them going forward. If you have a group, some cultural group that says, have as many children as possible, that will, whatever traits existed in that cultural group they'll tend to be more of those in the future, because there were more children. And that's kind of, so it's kind of this notion of kind of choice of the level of kind of choice of more children, less children, and that will determine how many of those traits exist in the population going forward. So there are other effects as well. Like, for example, there are plenty of diseases that, you know, would have killed us earlier in life, so to speak, had it not been for modern medicine. And its life expectancies have been getting progressively longer, particularly not the maximum sort of extension of life has not changed that much, but the fraction of people who reach kind of close to the maximum, that's gotten much, much larger as a result of medicine. Many of the kind of bugs that we know can develop, medicine has allowed us to fix. And so that means that there are things which in the past would have meant that, you know, that human wasn't going to make it to have children, for example. Now modern medicine lets them make it. And so whatever trait it was that would have prevented them from making it to have children, that trait in the past would have died off in the population, because they would have, those people wouldn't have made it to the point where they have children, but now they can. And so that means that trait can survive in the population where it wouldn't have been able to in the past. And you see, and different, so that's an effect. Another effect is the kind of socio-political forces that determine, you know, who chooses to have more children and who doesn't. You know, a very common issue is sort of the economics of having children. There are places where it's just really expensive to have children, in a sense that, you know, you have to take care of the children and they cost a lot. And if you're going to have them sort of be educationally competitive, you spend even more, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's, for some people, that's kind of a socio-political disincentive to have more children. And, you know, in a sense, the natural selection view of the population, and there's really no way around it. I mean, if there are more children with certain traits, then those traits will be more common in the population. That's just a necessary piece of the picture. So, you know, at times in the past, people have had terrible ideas about, you know, right now we think this type of human is worse than that other type of human. And that's something that was unfortunately a sort of bad consequence of the natural selection theory. It was kind of like, okay, now we understand how things work. Let's control the course of biological evolution. Disastrous idea. I mean, this was what led to all sorts of terrible things, particularly in the early part of the 20th century, often around the word eugenics, sort of, which, you know, is from Greek. It's sort of the good race type thing, and it's in the category of one of the worst kind of consequences of sort of taking a view of science and kind of saying, let's just build society around this, as it turns out, rather shallow view of what the science implies. So I think that, it's an interesting question whether we can see, you know, the traits that lead to people having more children, how are they correlated with other kinds of traits? Another thing that's true is the extent to which, you know, for us humans, where we have, you know, 2 parents per child, give or take, except for weird technological approaches, but it's basically 2 parents per child. The footnote there is that the mitochondria, which are in a sense separate parts of our cells, could in principle come from another parent if you sort of prepare if you do things kind of in a lab. But normally it's 2 parents per child. And there are other complicated evolutionary effects. Like, for example, there are questions like, I don't know, like, for example, how much, you know, if you have sort of the most efficient pairing of humans and sort of humans pair off in a way where they're optimally suited for each other, how does that affect what the progeny are like versus humans who are, you know, very different, who have children and so on? How does that affect what the future progeny are like? And that's those are more detailed effects. Then there are other effects, like at what age are people having children? That you might think that's irrelevant, but there are things where, okay, so much of what's passed down from parent to child is just purely genetics, and it's kind of randomly selected from the mother, father, you know, half from each, that gets passed down to each child. But there are some other effects. I mean, there are it was sort of a discredited view of biological evolution that sort of things that happen during the lifetime of the parent could have a direct biological effect. I mean, they can have an effect of things the parent learnt they could pass on as matters of knowledge to their children, but things that are biologically happen to the parent, could they pass them on? And it became clear that things like various kinds of deficiencies to do with bad access to various kinds of foods and so on, those could be passed on. And that's a place where, again, there's sort of a modification, to a footnote to the whole Darwinian story that happens there. But I think it's a good question. Are we descending towards the extinction? Was asked. Well, I don't think so. I mean, the population of the Earth is I think it's often hard to project what the population of the Earth is going to do, and there are many countries where you can see population is going up dramatically, but where demographic estimates show that it will turn over. Sometimes those are accurate, sometimes they are not. It often will depend on policies and other things and prosperity and so on in those countries. But I think the general belief is that the population of the world will continue going up, although maybe it will turn over. I mean, a general fact about sort of geopolitical fact is that in a first approximation, the more prosperous countries have lower birth rates. But that's not completely true. It's not true in all cultural groups within those countries. It's not a general idea, but it can be true. And that's partly for economic reasons sometimes, that people, if you're operating a family farm and, children are a really good source of labor for a family farm. And that's the reason in the US, for example, why people a bit more than 100 years ago, when the US was a largely agricultural agrarian society, why there were, I think, it was very typical for there to be very large families who then would be, help in the farm type thing. And that's in the kind of modern urban lifestyle, it's a bit of a different story. The children are expensive and they don't fit in the apartment and so on. So it's the different set of motivations. But I think that the kind of will there come a time when sort of the population, I mean the certain clearly there are sort of cultural forces at work of some kinds of cultural prejudices or whatever tend to lead to lower birth rates in some cultural populations, higher birth rates in others, and so that will tend to tip the balance of those different kinds of things going forward in time. But I don't think we're at risk of extinction for those kinds of reasons. Let's see. Talking of extinction, we have a question from D0 here. How likely is it for a big asteroid to hit the Earth? Not very. Seems to happen about every 100 million years, maybe every 50 million years. That's a long time. It's happened a few times probably in the history of the Earth in the 4.6 billion years the Earth has been around. The last really spectacular one, I guess you could call it spectacular after the fact, was 65 million years ago in the Gulf of Mexico, the asteroid that hit. And it's becoming fairly clear that there are some fossils that were formed the very afternoon that the asteroid hit the Earth of dinosaurs that were covered in I guess some kind of ash from the of pulverized rock from the impact and so on. I mean, that was a dramatic moment, I guess. It was, produced these huge tidal waves, produced at that time dramatically this kind of this generated a lot of small particles that ended up small dust, basically, that ended up going into the upper atmosphere of the Earth, and that basically blocked out the sun for a couple of years. And if you're a dinosaur without good HVAC and good heating and so on, it's a bad thing. And to be a dinosaur who really enjoyed the 70 degree Fahrenheit weather, to be plunged into something at 30 degrees Fahrenheit, it's not a good way to spend a couple of years. and that was a bad thing for the dinosaurs. I think there's pretty good evidence that the dinosaurs were on their way out anyway at that time, but that was kind of probably the final thing that sort of pushed them over the edge towards extinction. And there were no doubt other features. I mean, when you knock the Earth with an asteroid of that size, it has all kinds of consequences, probably for things to do with volcanoes and all kinds of other things. And the tidal wave, the tsunami that the thing produced, probably went a large part of the way across the US and all kinds of things like this. So kind of a messy situation. Now, is that about to happen? Don't think so. Wouldn't worry about it. And actually, we know it's not going to happen. We know it's not going to happen probably in the lifetime of anybody alive today, assuming that human lifespans don't expand absolutely dramatically, because we can track every asteroid and we can everything of that size. And it's I don't think there are any that are believed to be. I think there was one in 50 years time or something that looked like it might be on a collision course for Earth, but don't think it is. So I think these sort of big asteroid impacts, you know, a long time in advance. That's one of the things that comes from understanding physics and understanding laws of gravity and so on. So long as you can detect these kinds of asteroids, which you can with telescopes and so on, you can see what's coming. Now, the big question is, what would you do about it? Let's say there is a big asteroid heading for the Earth. What do we do? Well, clearly, I mean, there's lots of science fiction movie treatments of what to do in that situation. The likelihood is that you can nudge the asteroid, because so long as you reach it a long time before it's actually going to hit the Earth, you don't have to nudge it very much. Just a tiny nudge, tiny change of angle, tiny change of trajectory, and then it's going to miss the Earth. Maybe it will be kind of if you do the science correctly, having it graze the upper atmosphere and produce this amazing light show might be something people would like, although maybe it's not the best thing to, you know, it's kind of living dangerously to do that. But I think that it's likely to be possible. How you would do it, not completely clear. I mean, people talk about nuclear explosions. People talk about kind of putting things like just having progressive if it has ice, for example, water ice, for instance, progressively heating up pieces of it, so it starts spewing out steam, which will push it slightly. And I think there's some schemes with radiation pressure, with putting sort of solar with mirrors essentially on the thing to gradually use the pressure of light to deflect it. Those kinds of things. So that's the story of that. I think that people, I know a couple of people who are involved in the kind of asteroid defense business, both at the level of having contracts with the US government to like provide the spacecraft, to also trying to examine just how common are near-Earth asteroids of the right size. And the question of how common they are depends greatly on things like how much light does an asteroid typically emit? How much does it reflect? Like for the moon, for example, the moon looks pretty bright in the sky, but if the moon was a mirror, it will be unbelievably brighter than it actually is. The moon is actually quite, doesn't reflect much of the light that falls on. I think it's like a tenth of the light or something is what is reflected by moon rock and the rest of it is just absorbed of light from the sun. The albedo of the Earth, that's the albedo is the ratio of the amount of light reflected to the amount of light received. The albedo of the Earth is an important thing to know, and it depends a lot on whether there are clouds and things like that, or whether it's just, you know, a view of the ocean or something. The albedo of the Earth is important in determining how much the Earth heats up from the light of the sun, because if you're just reflecting all of that light back into space, it isn't absorbed and you don't get the heat from that. And that's something where one of the ways that one can imagine doing, for example, geoengineering, if you say the Earth's getting too hot, we want to cool it down, how can we do that? Well, we can do something a little bit like what happened to the dinosaurs. That is, we can put some kind of dust-like stuff in the upper atmosphere of the Earth, which will reflect light, prevent as much of it reaching the surface, and reduce the temperature of the surface. It's a difficult decision to say, let's go put little aerosols in the upper atmosphere and cool the Earth down, because it's something you don't get to say, we'll just cool down, you'll just cool down Kansas or something. Once you do that, you're cooling down the whole Earth. And that's something which sort of everybody, one imagines, would have to sort of agree that that's a good thing to do. And it's also the case that once you've done it, it's kind of like, did you really think through the consequences of this? As you start growing the glaciers or whatever happens as you cool the Earth down, is that okay? Or is there some glacier going to overtake some town somewhere? Or is it going to prevent ships getting through this or that place? What really are the consequences? And it's usually very hard to work out the consequences of something like that. Let's see. Well, there's a question, be a little bit complicated. Let's see. There's a question here from N asking, how far ahead can you talk about human evolution adapting with technological progression? This is kind of, we're continuing our theme from a little bit earlier about human evolution. I think the question of the sort of interweaving of technology with human evolution, there are pieces of that are kind of part of the obvious biological story of, life expectancies get longer, people who would otherwise not be able to have children are able to have children because of medical advances, these kinds of things. There are also other aspects of sort of technology that change the landscape of where humans, where humans can live. Another thing that's important is education. The fact that, one of the things that's sort of a great invention of our species is the ability, it seems, uniquely to pass on abstract knowledge from one generation to the next. There are other species that have ways to kind of show some stuff, like here's how to fly or something, or maybe they show that, it's not clear they show that, or here's how to, maybe some aspects of sort of behavior can be passed on sort of generation to generation by education. But we humans, with human language and with the things that we've learned about how to do education, we are kind of so far as we know, the unique example where you can really pass on knowledge. And one feature of passing on knowledge that really affects evolution is the following. If you are a critter that has this idea that you're going to, catch your prey by setting traps, doing this or that thing, and you're going to lay your eggs in a particular way on beaches or whatever else, and then something changes in the world and you can't do that anymore. Well, you are genetically programmed to do that, and that's kind of all you know. And every successive generation, it's got that same genetic programming. Gradually, over the course of many generations, maybe the thing that randomly mutated to have genetics that caused it to say, actually, we can lay our eggs in a tree or something instead, that will be the one that wins out. But if you have knowledge, if you have education, it's like one generation discovers, no, you don't dig out the sand to put your eggs, you can just put them in a tree. And then you say, let me just tell my children that's what to do and educate the next generation. That's an incredibly much faster way to make those changes, and that allows adaptation to things that happen in the world. Or, this is the amazing way to be more successful in living in the world and progressively having more children, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is the way to do that. And I think that's a way in which, in a sense, education, which in some ways relies on technology, it relies on things like writing, it relies on nowadays on communications and so on, that makes those kinds of things possible. It's also worth realizing that there are aspects of evolution that operate not just on the biology of humans, but also on the ideas that humans think about. I mean, this kind of notion of memes as well as genes. Memes was originally kind of the idea of sort of elements of thought, not necessarily, slogans on Instagram posts or whatever, that were things where it's an idea, the idea of arranging society with democracy, or the idea of doing this or that thing, of having these, or the idea of doing science or something. These ideas are things that have a sort of natural selection of their own, in the sense that they, if nobody likes them, they sort of eventually die out. If one person likes them and passes it on to more people, then they gradually get more prevalent in the population. And that process is a complicated and sometimes frustrating process to watch, because it's not always the case, as is probably the case in biological evolution. The best species don't always win, whatever best means. But that's something which sort of affects evolution, is this evolution of ideas as well as evolution of the biology of humans. And I think obviously the one critical aspect of evolution is the basic rhythm of evolution is there's one generation, it has children, the children have children, etc., and the previous generation dies off. And that is the phenomenon that's happened throughout biological time. And the question is, if there comes a point at which in human evolution that no longer happens, either because we sort of solve the biological problems of effective immortality, or because we decide to sort of go digital and decide that our existence is better in kind of the virtual world, so to speak, and all of our sort of future history is played out in a virtual environment. If those things happen, then that will dramatically change kind of what has been the rhythm of human evolution. And I think it's also the rhythm, to some extent, of of lots of things about human life. Is kind of like there's a limited lifespan, and this will happen and that will happen and so on. And so there's a set of things that people have the objective of doing. But it's a different story if the biological or digital you is kind of like, well, I'm going to be around in 1 million years. Let's let me decide what to do today. I've got another 300 million of these days to run, so to speak. It kind of changes the perspective, I think, a bit on what to do. I mean, certainly something one sees in human sort of society and cultural situations. There are some cultures where people are very concerned with this kind of longevity of progression of, we've been doing this for 500 years type thing. We've been carrying on this tradition for 500 years, and other places where people are like, what we're doing now, that's what we're doing. I don't really care what the last generation did, I don't care what happened in the past. It's a different kind of rhythm of activity. And I suppose that's a place where one can see sort of a model of what happens in the case of sort of effective immortality, of how that will play out. And from some point of view, it might be like, oh, if you've got an infinite time to do things, you won't get anything done today, maybe. Or maybe it's that means it's worth building for the future because you'll be around to witness that future. Hard to tell. All right, maybe one more here. Okay, there's a question from Eggy here. We're on the evolution thing. Could gene drive technology replace natural evolution in favor of intelligent design? Yeah, well, okay. So the basic point there is that with gene editing, there is as a result of discoveries made in the last, 10, 15 years, it's possible to basically target a piece of a genome, including a human genome, and say, just edit this piece of the genome. Whenever you see certain sequences on the genome that look like this, go splice out the piece in the middle and update it and change it to this. And so that's a way of changing. And the thing which is interesting about that is it changes not only if you change if you sort of make that change and the organism reproduces, and you made that change in the line of cells that will be reproduced, then you've changed that species permanently. It's not just you changed that particular organism, you changed all the children of that organism and so on, sort of forever. And okay, this might be my reminder that to wrap up here. But oh, perhaps not. No, I think that's okay. In any case, so the idea is, for example, one place where people have talked about this, when there are mosquitoes that give nasty diseases like malaria, particularly in Africa, there's kind of this idea, hey, why don't we just modify the mosquitoes? Just put a new genetic setup for mosquitoes and sort of push it through that population and just change the mosquitoes so they can't carry malaria and they're harmless and it's all good, so to speak. That's it's a little bit like put aerosols in the upper atmosphere of the Earth. It's kind of a hard decision to make because once you launch that, it's kind of hard to pull back from it. It's kind of a thing that's going to spread through this population. And, one has to, it's very hard to know what consequences it has. And I think there's a certain degree of kind of just how sure are we of the science and technology and so on. At what point are we sure enough that we want to make one of these global changes? I mean, I think the life of this pandemic that we've all been experiencing is perhaps not the best example of we really know everything about what the science and consequences of different kinds of things are going to be. It's been a story of many kinds of places where it's clear, as one could have predicted, and I certainly was aware of some of this, that things weren't going to go quite as the most obvious science would predict. And so it's a difficult thing to decide to make those changes. I think that there are other cases like, well, there are, but that's a place where you could decide, yes, we're going to change the human population or change the mosquito population or change the human population. And one certainly wonders whether in the future there'll be kind of this fashion, people will say, I really want my children to have green eyes. Okay, great, we can modify that gene and children will have green eyes. Or I really want this or that trait. And that could go horribly wrong, because it could be the case that, say, for example, everybody wants a child who will act like a leader, and then the whole world is full of people who want to act like leaders. This might not end well. I mean, it's or some other trait that that might be good in one case, but might not play well either for the whole population or even just turn out to play well in the end. Or somebody says, I think I really want my kid to have this or that characteristic because it's in fashion right now. I mean, it's like if you look at first names of kids, there are tremendous waves of sort of fashion for different names. I mean, I think my parents always claimed that they've been innovative with my first name, which kind of the data shows was definitely not the case. Stephen was a pretty common name when I was born, maybe not as common in England as in the US. One of the things that always charms me about this is there's in Wolfram Alpha, if you type in a first name, because it knows the frequencies of different names over the course of time, it can predict for you what the most likely age of a person with that name is. And it really does remarkably well, remarkably often, because there have been these big waves of popularity for different names. One thing that always charms me is that I think Stephen was a particularly common name in the US about, I don't know, 60 to 65 to 75 years ago. And so people and everybody who was called Stephen at that time got nicknamed Steve. And so for me, it's just a dead giveaway that if somebody calls me Steve, which is not what people usually call me, they're sort of guaranteed American over the age of 60. That's then they'll call me Steve, and they'll do so pretty much 100% of the time. And that was sort of a sign of the Stephen bump or something, or the Steve bump that existed at that time. That was sort of a fashion in first names. That's a place where people pick something about a kid and it sort of survives over the course of the life of that kid unless they choose to change their name. And often you see these kind of secondary bumps of a name that was popular at one time, and then it'll be somebody's grandparents' name, and so they'll name the kid after that. And you see these kind of echoes of different name popularities. Well, the same thing might happen with biological traits. It'd be rather weird of this, oh, well, you're 40 years old, so you probably have green eyes because that was popular at that time in sort of the history of things being developed. I mean, I tend to think these things are probably in the category of not a good idea, unintended consequences that are bad. But on the other hand, science can achieve some things, and so one has to sort of balance those different possibilities. All right. Well, I think we should wrap up for now today. But I thank you for lots of interesting questions. I see there are many more that I didn't have a chance to get to here. And I think look forward to doing this again. I'm not sure if next week we'll hit a day where I'll be able to do it, but certainly within the next couple of weeks, we should be doing this again. And otherwise, if happy holidays to people, if it's that time of year for you. And